They saw me as just another delivery guy from upstate, a nobody. They tossed a priceless, shattered antique at my feet and told me I'd be paying for it for the rest of my life. Later, they were dangling a six-figure salary and a Rolex, begging me to stay. I just told them, the Hayes family craft isn't for sale, and neither is our integrity. They didn't know that these calloused hands, accustomed to the handlebars of an e-bike, held a legacy of 100 years of Hayes and Sons woodworks. They didn't know these hands held the only hope of clearing my grandfather's name. So, they laid their final trap, the cursed painting they called the Sorrowful Tree. They thought it would drag me into their abyss. Instead, it lit the fuse on a fire that would burn for my family's honor. 1 foot, if you can't fix this chair, your company is finished. You hear me? Finished. Leo Hayes had just dropped off the DoorDash order when the roar erupted from the penthouse apartment. The client, Arthur Roth, a private equity shark in his late 40s, was stabbing a finger at a manager in a tailored suit. Mr. Roth, this is a genuine Newport Chippendale, an 18th century antique. We can't just touch it. The few specialists in the country who could handle this are booked a year out, the manager stammered, sweat beading on his forehead, his back bent in a perfect 90-degree angle. Roth paced his living room, the Patek Philippe on his wrist catching the light and flashing like a distress signal. I don't care. I'm hosting a private auction here this weekend, and this chair is the centerpiece. If something goes wrong, who's going to pay for my reputation? Leo stood silently in the foyer, calculating whether this delay would cost him a tip. He'd been in New York for 2 years. 2 years ago, he was just a small-town woodworker in rural Pennsylvania, making traditional furniture with his grandfather that nobody wanted anymore. He was barely scraping by, making less than $2,000 a month. When a friend from back home bragged about making a killing as a delivery driver in the city, Leo packed up his tools and left. Now he was standing in a duplex that overlooked the entire East River, watching a man worth hundreds of millions sweat like a cornered animal. Roth was the quintessential self-made man, ruthless, efficient, with zero patience for employees or service workers. On Leo's usual deliveries, Roth wouldn't even bother to look up. To him, Leo was just a symbol in a blue uniform. Just then, Roth's assistant moved as if to steady the wobbling chair. "Don't touch it!" Roth and the manager screamed in unison. Leo couldn't help but lean in for a look. Just one glance, and an old familiar itch started in his fingers. It was a classic block-front chair, its lines graceful, its mahogany finished deep and warm. It was the real deal. The problem was the front right leg. The mortise and tenon joint was loose. Roth was still bellowing in his phone. "What? You want to fly in an expert from Met? Who do you think I am? I don't have that kind of time." A strange impulse took over Leo. "Mr. Roth," he said, his voice quiet. Can I take a look?" The living room fell silent. Everyone turned to stare at him as if he'd grown a second head. Roth's brow furrowed as he looked Leo up and down. "You? A delivery guy? What would you know about it?" "My family's in the business," Leo said. He was nervous, but looking at the chair gave him a surge of confidence. Roth's assistant, desperate for a solution, jumped in. "Sir, maybe let him try. It's not like it could get any worse." Roth hesitated for a second, then waved a dismissive hand. "You break it, you'll be working to pay it off for the rest of your life. Go ahead." Leo took off his delivery jacket, walked carefully to the chair, and knelt. He didn't shake it. Instead, he tapped his fingers gently on the connections of the leg, his ear tilted, listening. "It's just a loose dowel pin." "Not a big deal," Leo said, standing up. "A dowel pin?" the manager in the suit asked, completely lost. "A small wooden peg used to secure the joint," Leo explained. "Over time, the wood shrinks and it comes loose." "So what do you suggest?" Roth asked, his tone skeptical. "Find a small piece of hardwood, carve a new pin, and tap it back in. A little isinglass glue would help. Isinglass glue? Roth's brow furrowed even deeper. "What the hell is that?" "A traditional adhesive. It doesn't damage the wood, and you can always take it apart later if you need to," Leo said, scratching his head sheepishly. I think I have my tool kit in the insulated bag on my bike." 10 minutes later, Leo reappeared with a small, handmade wooden mallet, a scrap of dark, unfamiliar wood, and a small glass jar filled with a pale yellow, gelatinous substance. Ignoring the astonished looks, he took a small carving knife and, with a few deft movements, shaped the hardwood into a wedge smaller than a toothpick. He used a thin wire to apply a tiny amount of the fish glue into the seam of the joint, then aligned the new pin and gave it a few gentle taps with the mallet. Tap, tap. It slid into place. The whole process took less than 5 minutes. Leo stood up, brushing the dust from his hands. "Done. Let it sit for an hour for the glue to cure." It was a miracle. An hour later, The assistant cautiously reached for the chair. The leg that had been on the verge of collapse was now rock solid, as steady as granite, and there wasn't a single scratch or mark on the chair's surface. Roth's eyes were wide. That's it. He walked over, tested it himself, his face a mask of disbelief. Those so-called experts hemmed and hawed for an hour and couldn't figure it out. And you fixed it in minutes? Leo nodded. It's an old craft. Handed down. Not as complicated as people make it out to be. Roth was silent for a long time. He circled the chair twice, his gaze finally shifting from the priceless antique to the young man in his early 20s standing before him. Kid, Roth said, his voice a little strained. You really used to do this for a living? Yeah. My grandpa taught me, Leo answered honestly. Roth looked at Leo's hands, calloused but incredibly steady, and a complex expression crossed his face. He pulled out his phone. What's your name? I'm sending you $20,000. Leo was stunned. 20 grand. That was more than he made in a month of grueling deliveries. And he had no idea it was only the beginning. At the auction that weekend, Roth told anyone who would listen about his miraculously restored 18th century Chippendale and the mysterious delivery guy who had saved it. The next day, Leo's phone rang. Hello, is this Leo Hayes? I'm a friend of Arthur Roth's. I have a Gilded Age rosewood screen at my place. Seems to have a bit of an issue. Hello, is this Leo Hayes? I'm a friend of Roth's. The name's Croft. The voice on the other end was young, laced with an arrogance it didn't bother to hide. I have a rosewood folding screen. Seems to have a bit of an issue. You should come take a look. It wasn't a request. It was a command. He gave me an address that my GPS showed was in another, even more exclusive, ultra-rich enclave. After hanging up, I stared at the $20,000 deposit in my bank account, still feeling a little dazed. It was more money than I'd make busting my ass for a month under the brutal sun and in pouring rain. But I wasn't entirely happy. There was an emptiness inside me, a feeling that something I'd left behind in a dusty wooden chest back home had been unearthed. It was something that smelled of wood shavings and carried the weight of my grandfather's size. It took me 40 minutes on my e-bike to find the place, a standalone mansion that made Roth's penthouse look modest. The security guard at the gate eyed my delivery uniform with pure contempt. What do you want? You don't belong here. I was about to call this Croft character when a voice drifted from the house. Let him in. A young man in a silk shirt and with professionally disheveled flaxen hair walked out, sizing me up. You're Leo? I nodded. This was Julian Croft. Behind him stood several other men in sharp suits and wire-rimmed glasses, looking polished and predatory. Gee, see, you really called a delivery guy for this? One of the men in glasses said, his tone oozing flattery. This antique rosewood screen is one of your prized possessions. Exactly, another chimed in, gesturing with his hand. We've already analyzed it. It's clearly an internal structural change in the wood. It needs professional dehumidification and realignment. The entire process will take at least 3 months, and the cost. He made a gesture for the number 8. 800,000. I swallowed hard. Croft ignored them and led me into the living room. The screen stood in the center of the room, magnificent and intricately carved. I saw the problem immediately. To a normal person, it would be invisible. Only from a specific angle, in just the right light, could you see an infinitesimal warp on one of the panels. It was like a perfectly flat sheet of paper that had been scored by a fingernail. See it? Croft asked, crossing his arms, watching me with amusement. I nodded. The wood absorbed moisture, then dried out too quickly. The internal stress is uneven. It's twisted. The man in glasses immediately shot back. Nonsense. Mister, Croft's mansion has a climate control system. How could it possibly get damp? I ignored him and walked to the screen, pointing to an inconspicuous corner. Right here, the air conditioning vent blows directly on this spot. Over time, the moisture from the cold air seeped in right here. Then you probably felt the room was humid and turned on the dehumidifier. The intense drying process made it contract unevenly, and it warped. The room was silent. The faces of the experts turned from red to white. Croft's eyes lit up as if he'd just discovered a fascinating new toy. Interesting. So how do you fix it? Croft asked. They said it has to be taken apart, sent to some restoration lab, and worked on for 3 months. I shook my head. You don't. The wood is alive. It has its own temperament, I said. If you try to force it, it'll fight back. It'll break before it bends. You have to work with it, follow its nature. Croft smiled. And how do you plan to follow its nature? The man in glasses spoke up again. Gee, see, don't listen to this nonsense. This is rosewood, not some cheap pine from a lumberyard. If he breaks it, he couldn't afford to pay for it if you sold him into slavery. Croft waved a hand impatiently. Shut up. He took a watch from his wrist and tossed it onto the coffee table with a heavy thud. A Patek Philippe, even flashier than Roth's. If you can fix this without moving it an inch, without taking it out of this room, this watch is yours, he said. But if you damage it. He didn't finish the sentence, but the chill in his eyes was colder than the air from the vent. The so-called experts all wore smug, schadenfreude-filled expressions, waiting to see how I would crash and burn. I looked at the watch, then at the screen. That old woodworker's stubbornness flared up inside me again. Deal. I need a basin of boiling water, a few clean, thick towels, and... I glanced around the room and pointed to a shelf of massive, hardcover art books. And those books. 02, a smirk played on Croft's lips, his eyes filled with the detached amusement of someone watching a show. That's it. That's it. The experts could no longer contain their laughter. Boiling water? Towels? Gee, see, is he planning on giving the screen a bath? I'm telling you, he's a con artist. He's gonna try to grab your watch and run. Croft didn't say a word, just snapped his fingers. A moment later, a maid brought in a large basin of steaming water. Just as I had at Roth's place, I took off my delivery jacket, folded it neatly, and set it aside. I walked to the screen and took a deep breath. My grandfather used to say that every piece of wood has a life. To fix it, you first have to talk to it. I held my hand out, not touching the screen, but hovering it in the air, feeling the subtle force of the warp. I soaked a towel in the scalding water and wrung it out until it was half dry. Steam rose, carrying a damp warmth. I carefully applied the towel to the outer side of the warped area, the convex side. He's insane. Applying direct heat and moisture to rosewood is a cardinal sin, the man in glasses shrieked. Croft frowned, but didn't stop me. I ignored them, my focus entirely on my hands. The heat slowly seeped through the towel into the surface of the wood. I could feel the wood fibers, which had been tensed from the rapid drying, slowly beginning to relax. It was an incredibly delicate process. The temperature couldn't be too high. The duration couldn't be too long. It was like performing microsurgery. After a few minutes, I removed the towel. I used a dry towel to wipe away the surface moisture, then carefully leaned the heavy art books against the other side of the screen, the concave side, using their weight to apply a gentle, continuous pressure. That's it. Croft raised an eyebrow. No. Now we wait. Wait? For how long? Until it decides to straighten itself out, I said, then walked over and sat on a nearby sofa. The atmosphere in the living room turned strange. A young man in a delivery company t-shirt sat casually on a plush sofa. Across from him, a group of wealthy socialites and experts stared, dumbfounded. Time ticked by. Croft grew impatient, tapping a rhythm on the table with his fingers. Kid, you're not messing with me, are you? Shoo, I said, holding up a hand. Don't disturb it. It's thinking. At that, the experts nearly burst with indignation. Absurd. This is utterly preposterous. Gee, see, you can't let him continue this charade, one of them said, reaching for the books. Don't touch them. I shot up from the sofa. My voice wasn't loud, but it carried an authority that could not be questioned. The expert flinched, pulling his hand back. My gaze swept over him, cold. If you touch them, this screen will be ruined for good. And then it won't be just about a watch. Croft's eyes flickered. He stared at me, as if trying to read something on my face. I met his gaze without flinching. My confidence didn't come from his watch or his power. It came from my grandfather, from the craft handed down through generations of my family. Another hour passed. I felt it was time. I walked over and gently, one by one, removed the art books. Then I stepped back to the same angle where the warp had been visible. Everyone in the room held their breath, their eyes following me. The miracle happened again. The visible twist was gone. The surface of the screen was as smooth as glass, perfectly flat. It was as if it had never been damaged. That's impossible. The man in glasses looked like his eyes were about to pop out of his head. He rushed forward, practically pressing his face against the screen, inspecting it from every angle, muttering, impossible. Unscientific. Croft stood up and walked to the screen. He ran his fingertips slowly over the repaired area. The surface was cool and smooth. The playful arrogance on his face vanished, replaced by a complex mixture of shock and fervent excitement. He spun around and stared at me, his eyes boring into mine. Who the hell are you? 03, the delivery guy, I answered calmly. Croft laughed and shook his head. No, a delivery guy doesn't have your eyes, and he definitely doesn't have your hands. He walked back to the table, picked up the Patek Philippe, and shoved it into my hand. It's yours. The metal of the watch was cold and heavy. I weighed it in my hand. This thing was probably worth enough to build a new house back home. Thanks, Mr. Croft. I slipped it into my pocket. The so-called experts, especially the man in glasses, looked mortified. They had been thoroughly humiliated. Don't get cocky, kid. You just got lucky. The man snapped, unwilling to concede. This traditional craft stuff is all hocus pocus. There's no scientific basis for it. You didn't break it this time, but what about next time? Mister, Croft has so many priceless treasures. What if you ruin one of them? Croft waved his hand, cutting him off. That's enough, Professor Thorne. You can all leave. He paused, then added, and don't bother sending me the bill. Professor Thorne's face turned the color of raw liver. He and his colleagues scurried out, but not before Thorne shot me a venomous glare. It was the look of a snake coiled in the grass, waiting to strike. Now it was just me and Croft in the room. Leo Hayes, right? He said. Ever thought about quitting the delivery gig and coming to work for me? All these old things of mine need someone to look after them. I'll make you an offer. $300,000 a year, plus a car and an apartment. What do you say? He leaned back on the sofa, crossing his legs, once again the man in complete control. 300,000. The number exploded in my head. Wasn't this why I came to New York? For the money? With that kind of cash, I could give my grandpa a comfortable life, get him away from the pungent smell of glue and varnish. But I looked at Croft. In his eyes, I was probably no different from the screen or the watch. An interesting toy, a collectible. Being his private consultant sounded glamorous, but in reality, I'd be a high-class servant. My grandfather always said a craftsman has to have integrity. Your hands are your own. Your skill is your own. You don't become someone's lapdog. My mind was in turmoil. On one side was a life of luxury, right within my grasp. On the other was the lesson my grandfather had ingrained in my very bones. I was silent for a long time. Croft didn't push, just sipped his wine, swirling it gently. Mr. Croft, thank you for the offer, I finally said. But I can't take the job. Croft stopped swirling his wine, looking at me with surprise. Why? Not enough. I shook my head. This craft was taught to me by my grandfather. He said I should only fix things that I have a connection with. A connection? When I feel right about it, and it feels right about me. It needs me, and I happen to be able to help. Who I work for, or how much money I make, that's not important. The words sounded a bit pretentious, even to me, but they were the truth. Croft stared at me for a moment, then burst out laughing. Interesting. Really interesting. Leo, you're the most interesting person I've met in a long time. All right, I won't force you. He stood up and handed me a business card. This is my personal number. If you ever need my help with anything, or if you change your mind, call me anytime. And one more thing, he said, his expression turning serious. That Professor Thorne you pissed off today, his name is Marcus Thorne. He has some pull in the antique restoration scene in this city. He's not a good person, and he holds a grudge. You should watch your back. I took the card and nodded. Thanks for the warning. I turned to leave. Wait, Croft called out again. That chair at Roth's place. You fixed that, right? Yeah. Good work, he said, a strange glint in his eye. But have you ever stopped to think, he continued, why a chair that's been around for centuries would just happen to break at that exact time, in that exact place? My blood ran cold. He was right. It was too much of a coincidence. Everything was too perfect. I was like a character in a play, set up to be in the right place at the right time to solve the right problem. And just like that, I was drawn into their world. It felt like a setup, a trap designed specifically for me. A cold sweat broke out on my back. 4-foot Leo. We have a problem. Get over here now. On the phone, Arthur Roth's voice was no longer composed. It was thick with suppressed fury. My heart sank. Croft's words were still echoing in my ears. I hung up, didn't even bother to change out of my t-shirt, and raced to Roth's building on my e-bike, running 3 red lights along the way. When I stepped back into the penthouse, overlooking the East River, the atmosphere was glacial. Roth sat on the sofa, his face a thundercloud, saying nothing. In the center of the living room, the Chippendale chair I had personally restored lay on the floor. One of its legs was snapped in two, shattered into several pieces. It was a gruesome sight. Standing nearby was the last person I wanted to see. Marcus Thorne, the professor I had publicly humiliated. He saw me, and a smug, cat-and-mouse smile spread across his face. Mr. Roth, look, your man is here. Roth looked up, his eyes, the same eyes that could liquidate a company without a second thought, were now like 2 daggers aimed straight at me. Leo, he began slowly, each word squeezed out from between his teeth. I trusted you. I raved about you to all my friends. And this is how you repay me. Thorne fanned the flames. Mr. Roth, I told you these backwoods methods are unreliable. Restoring antiques is a rigorous science, not just a matter of knocking things around. In his haste, he used some crude wooden pin, which destroyed the original balance of the mortise and tenon joint. under the stress of the last few days. Of course, it was going to break. He pointed at the fragments on the floor, his voice filled with theatrical anguish. And now look, a priceless 18th century antique, a piece worth millions, completely destroyed. This isn't about money anymore. This is about the desecration of our cultural heritage. Every word was a hammer blow. Roth's assistant, the same young man I'd warned before, stood off to the side, his head bowed, refusing to look at me. Everyone in the room stared at me as if I were a criminal. I was trapped. I felt like I'd fallen into a deep, cold pit. They had dug it long ago, just waiting for me to jump in. My mind went blank. Rage, betrayal, and a sliver of fear. I was just a woodworker from a small town. How could I fight these powerful, connected people? With a single word, they could bury me under millions of dollars of debt and ruin my life forever. I'm finished. The thought sent a chill through my entire body. No, wait. My grandfather's voice echoed in my head, though it doesn't lie. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to calm down. I didn't look at Roth or Thorne. I walked to the pile of broken pieces and knelt. I picked up the shattered leg. My repair was at the joint. I had used isinglass glue and a tiny wedge to reinforce the loose connection. But the break was in the middle of the leg itself, a good 6 inches away from my work. The break. I ran my finger over the fractured surface. It was clean, too clean. Mahogany is a dense, hard wood with an interlocking grain. A natural break should have a ragged, splintered edge. This break, while not a clean cut, had the distinct characteristics of a fracture caused by a sudden, immense external force. This chair didn't just collapse. It was smashed. My eyes fell on the edge of a larger fragment. There I saw a tiny, almost invisible indentation. It wasn't part of the wood's natural grain. It was a small, crescent-shaped dent, and on it, a faint, almost imperceptible metallic sheen. An image flashed in my mind. Marcus Thorne. At Croft's mansion, he had been wearing a massive gold ring set with a strangely shaped, ugly stone. I shot my head up and stared directly at Thorne. He seemed startled by my gaze, instinctively taking a step back and hiding his hand behind his back. I stood up, but I didn't accuse him directly. Holding the fragment, I turned to Roth. Mr. Roth, my voice was quiet but clear. This chair didn't break on its own. I held up the piece, showing him the small dent. Mahogany is one of the hardest woods in the world. For it to snap in the middle like this, there's only one possibility. Someone took a very hard, heavy object with a sharp edge and struck it hard from the side. The living room was dead silent. I looked at Thorne's now ashen face and said, word by word, the person who hit it was probably wearing a rather large ring. Wouldn't you say? 05. The air in the room seemed to freeze. The color drained from Thorne's face, leaving it a sickly purple. His lips trembled, but no words came out. Roth was no fool. He was a shark who had navigated the treacherous waters of high finance for decades. My words were like a key, unlocking all the suspicious details in his mind. Why had Thorne shown up here so conveniently? Why had he immediately, and with such certainty, placed all the blame on me? Why was he acting more distraught than if his own father had died? Roth's gaze, like a pair of X-ray beams, slowly moved from me to Marcus Thorne. There was no anger in his eyes, only a chilling coldness that was far more terrifying. Professor, Roth said, his voice dangerously calm. Could I have a look at the ring on your hand? Thorne flinched as if he'd been tasered. Mr. Roth, what are you implying? You suspect me? I was only heartbroken over your priceless antique. This kid is lying through his teeth. How can you believe a delivery boy over me, an expert? He grew more agitated as he spoke, spittle flying from his lips as he tried to mask his panic with volume. Roth didn't speak. He just watched him. The silent pressure was more intimidating than any shouting match. Standing to the side, Roth's assistant looked even worse than Thorne, the back of his shirt soaked through with sweat. Suddenly it all clicked. One man might not have a nerve, but what if there was an inside man? My gaze shifted to the assistant. He immediately recoiled like a startled rabbit, avoiding my eyes. Mr. Roth, I said again, it's actually very simple to prove. Your security in this building must be top-notch, right? There have to be security cameras in the living room. Just check the footage from last night until this morning. That should clear things up. As I spoke, I kept my eyes locked on the assistant. His knees buckled, and he nearly collapsed. Now, even an idiot could see what had happened. Roth's expression turned to ice. He didn't even need to see the security footage. He looked at his assistant, the young man who had been with him for years. Kevin. He said only his name. The assistant, Kevin, completely broke down. Mr. Roth, it wasn't my fault, he wailed. It was Professor Thorne. He made me do it. He pointed a trembling finger at Thorne. He came to me, said if I could just loosen the kid's repair and make the chair a little wobbly, he'd give me 20 grand. He said he could convince you it was a botched repair, then he would take over the job and charge you a fortune. I was greedy. I agreed, but I swear I didn't mean to break it. I just used one of my dad's old collectible walnuts to tap the leg, just to loosen it a bit. I had no idea it was so brittle. It just snapped. The truth was out. A stupid, greedy conspiracy. Thorne was ashen-faced, looking as though his spine had been removed, and he slumped in on himself. Roth stood up. He didn't rage. He didn't even spare another glance at the two men. He simply took out his phone and made a call. Legal? Get the papers ready. I'm suing Marcus Thorne and my assistant, Kevin, for commercial fraud and willful destruction of property. Also, notify the Collectors Guild. Make sure everyone hears about Professor Thorne's heroic actions today. He hung up, having dealt with them as if they were two flies. Then he walked over to me. For the first time, this man of immense wealth and power looked at me as an equal, with a hint of apology in his eyes. Leo, I owe you an apology. I was blind. I almost wronged you. I shook my head, a mix of emotions churning inside me. This world was even more treacherous than I had imagined. Mr. Roth, that doesn't matter now. I pointed to the shattered pieces on the floor. The question is, what are we going to do about this chair? A look of bitter hope crossed Roth's face. Can it be saved? 06 it can, I said. But not here. Roth's eyes lit up. What do you need? Just name it. The best tools, the rarest materials, I can get them for you. I shook my head. Mr. Roth, this isn't a problem you can just throw money at. Mending a clean break is 100 times harder than reinforcing a joint. It's a technique called grafting. It requires a piece of vintage wood, same species, same age, even grown in a similar environment, to be perfectly joined to the broken ends. And I need a proper workshop, with professional vices, a climate-controlled curing room, and my own tools, the tools I had left to gather dust back home. Roth fell silent. He wasn't hesitating. He was processing, calculating. A few seconds later, he made a decision. Leo, I have a proposal for you. You don't work for me. We become partners. I'll provide the capital and the space. I will set you up with the best antique restoration workshop in New York. No, in the entire country. All the hardware, the connections, the resources, I'll handle it. You just provide the skill. You'll be the soul of the workshop. And we split all profits 50-50. I was floored. I thought he would offer me a salary, like Croft did, to be his personal technician. I never expected him to offer me a partnership. That meant we were equals. I would no longer be the delivery guy or the woodworker they looked down on. I would be a business owner, a partner. To have my own workshop. The idea was like a seed that instantly sprouted and grew wild in my mind. I thought my grandfather. His lifelong dream was to restore the family name, to make Hayes and Sons Woodworks mean something again. But he spent his entire life as an unknown old craftsman in a forgotten small town. Now I had a chance. Here, in New York, the most vibrant city in the country, I could build a new workshop for the Hayes family. My blood was humming. This wasn't about money or fame. This was for my grandfather, for the craft that was almost lost, for the pride that was etched into the bones of my family. Deal, I said, extending my hand. Roth smiled, a look of relief and admiration on his face. He shook my hand firmly. Welcome, partner. A former delivery driver and a multimillionaire, standing over the ruins of an 18th century antique, had just sealed a deal. Things moved with incredible speed. The very next day, Roth's secretary took me to see a location. It was a beautiful old brownstone in a quiet corner of Greenwich Village, with a massive, unfinished basement. Mr. Hayes, Mr. Roth said this will be your workshop. Just draw up a list of whatever you need for the renovation, the secretary said, her voice full of respect. I stood in the empty basement, and I could already hear the sound of a hand plane gliding over wood, smell the unique scent of isinglass glue and fresh shavings. I took out my phone and dialed a familiar number. It rang for a long time before someone picked up. Hello, Leo. It was my grandfather's voice, weak and tired. Grandpa, it's me. My nose tingled. How are you? In the city? Are you eating properly? I'm good, Grandpa, I said, trying to keep my voice light. I'm going to open a woodworking shop here in New York. There was silence on the other end. After a long moment, my grandfather spoke, his voice trembling in a way I'd never heard before. Really? Really? Good. That's good. Your grandpa will be waiting to see you hang the Hayes and Sons Woodwork sign in New York City. When I hung up, I couldn't hold it in any longer. The tears came. I clenched my fists. This wasn't just a job or a business. This was my destiny. 07 The workshop came together faster than I could have imagined. Roth's money worked like magic. A high-precision table saw from Germany, custom-made hand planes from Japan, and a whole set of antique restoration tools I had only ever seen in books. It all arrived within a week. The basement was transformed into a professional, climate-controlled workspace and curing room. The ground floor of the brownstone became an elegant reception area and gallery. Everything was ready, except for one crucial element, a piece of vintage mahogany that could match the broken chair. That kind of thing was harder to find than gold. It wasn't about money. It was about luck, about fate. Roth used all his connections, contacting major auction houses and private collectors, but came up empty. I was getting anxious. The workshop's first major project was this chair. Without the right wood, it was all for nothing. Then, one day, Julian Croft called. "Leo, I heard you're looking for vintage mahogany." "Yeah, you know a guy?" "Not exactly, but I know a place where you might find what you're looking for." "What place?" "Out in Queens. There's a spot they call the Ghost Market." "Isn't that where they sell fakes?" I asked, skeptical. "That's what they tell the tourists." Croft laughed on the other end. "The real market doesn't open until after midnight. It's a shady place, all sorts of characters. The stuff they sell is a mix of junk and gems. But every once in a while, you can find some real rarities there. But they don't care about money or who you are. The only thing that matters is your eye. And word is, the whole place is run by a mysterious old man they call Silas. If you got the guts to go, I can have my driver take you." My interest was piqued. If I couldn't find it through official channels, maybe a place like this really could produce a miracle. "No thanks, Mr. Croft. I'll go myself." I didn't want to be in his debt again. Besides, for a place like that, it was better to go alone. That night, following Croft directions, I took my e-bike out to Queens. It was a massive, abandoned warehouse district. By day, it was probably unremarkable, but at midnight, it gave off a strange, eerie vibe. I parked my bike outside and walked in. Inside, it was another world. Huge warehouses were lit up, filled with people. But the entire market was unnervingly quiet. Everyone spoke in hushed tones, like a gathering of ghosts. They sold everything imaginable. Old coins, antique furniture, paintings, you name it. A quick scan told me 99% of it was junk, laughably bad fakes. But I didn't give up. I went from warehouse to warehouse, booth to booth. I didn't look at the objects with my eyes. I tried to feel their presence, their aura. My grandfather used to say that old things have their own spirit, an essence that settles in them over time. Just as I was about to lose hope, in the darkest corner of the most remote warehouse, I saw a booth. The vendor was an old man wearing dark sunglasses, sitting silently on a small stool. He had only one item for sale. A piece of wood, about 3 feet long and as thick as my wrist. It was dark and nondescript, looking like a discarded beam from a demolition site. But the moment I saw it, my heart skipped a beat. That familiar, rich, slightly spicy scent. It was mahogany. And not just any mahogany. It was old-growth heartwood, Cuban mahogany. I walked over and knelt, my hand trembling as I reached out to touch it. "Don't touch," the old man in sunglasses said suddenly. His voice was raspy, like 2 pieces of sandpaper rubbing together. "This isn't for sale." My heart sank. "Sir, I really need this." "Name your price." The old man shook his head. "No amount of money can buy it." He paused and took off his sunglasses. Beneath them were 2 empty, unfocused eyes. He was blind. "I don't sell it. I trade." "Trade? What do you want?" The blind man grinned, revealing a set of yellowed teeth. A story about wood. 08 trading a story for a priceless piece of antique mahogany? It sounded insane. A few other vendors nearby shot me looks as if I were a fool. But looking into the blind man's empty eyes, I knew he wasn't joking. I took a deep breath and sat down in front of him. Okay. And so, in that strange midnight market, I began to tell my story to a blind stranger. I started with my great-grandfather, the founder of Hayes & Sons Woodworks. I talked about my grandfather, how he stubbornly held onto the old ways in an era that no longer valued craftsmen. I talked about how I had grown tired of the dusty workshop and run off to New York City on a whim. I told him about wearing a blue uniform, weaving through a concrete jungle, delivering food that was either getting cold or wilting. I told him about Roth's Chippendale chair and Croft's rosewood screen. I talked about my understanding of wood, about the yin and yang of a mortise and tenon joint, about the unique scent of wood shavings. I wasn't talking about technique. I was talking about a feeling, a connection to wood that ran in my blood. The old man listened in silence. He didn't interrupt, didn't show any emotion. He was like a statue carved from driftwood, but occasionally he would tilt his head slightly, as if using his ears to catch the faintest emotions in my words. When I finished, the only sound in the warehouse was a distant cough. My throat was dry, but my heart felt lighter than it had in years. It was as if I had finally unburdened myself of something I had been carrying for a long time. The old man was silent for a very long time, so long that I thought he had fallen asleep. Just as I was about to get up and leave, he let out a long sigh. It was a sigh filled with nostalgia, with emotion, and with a trace of sadness I couldn't quite place. "Your grandfather," he began in his raspy voice. "Is his name, by any chance, Samuel Hayes?" I felt like I had been struck by lightning. I looked up, my blood turning to ice. "How? How did you know?" The blind man slowly reached into his coat and pulled out a small object wrapped in red cloth. He unwrapped it layer by layer. Inside was a small seal carved from boxwood. On the bottom were 4 words: Samuel Hayes, carver. It was my grandfather's personal seal. I used to play with it as a kid, but it had been lost for years. My grandfather had been heartbroken. How? How do you have this?" My voice trembled. A complex smile formed on the old man's face. Decades ago, at the old cabinet makers guild in Boston, he and I were apprentices together. He was the senior, I was the junior. Later, things happened. I lost my sight, left Boston, and ended up here in New York. He gave me this seal before I left. He said, "To see the seal is to see the man." My mind was reeling. A fellow apprentice? This mysterious Silas, the master of the ghost market, was my grandfather's junior apprentice? My great-uncle in the craft? The world suddenly felt very small. "Come here, boy," the old man beckoned. I moved closer and knelt before him. He reached out with his hands, calloused and scarred, and felt my head, my face, my shoulders, just as my grandfather used to do. "The resemblance is uncanny," he murmured. "You're the spitting image of your grandfather when he was young, and you have the same stubborn streak in you. Exactly the same." He pushed the piece of mahogany towards me. "Take it. It belongs with you. Samuel's grandson can't let his legacy gather dust." He reached into his coat again and pulled out another object, this one wrapped in oilcloth. It was a small, worn notebook, its edges frayed. "This was also your grandfather's. He left it with me. I've kept it safe for him for half a century. Now it's time it went back to its rightful owner." With trembling hands, I took the notebook. Tears I could no longer control streamed down my face. 09, I returned to the workshop with the heavy piece of mahogany and the thin notebook. It was 4 in the morning. The city was asleep, but I was wide awake, buzzing with an electric energy. I turned on all the lights in the workshop and carefully placed the wood on my workbench. Then I washed my hands and, with the reverence of a prayer, opened my grandfather's notebook. The handwriting was his, lean, strong, as if carved with a knife. There were no long essays, only hand-drawn diagrams and brief notes. There were hundreds of joinery techniques I had never seen or even heard of. There were recipes for natural adhesives, like how to prepare different types of fish glue for different species of wood. And there were scattered thoughts. Wood has a soul. Follow its nature, never force it. An object has a spirit. A craftsman must approach it with reverence. Form is the bone. Character is the soul. An object without a soul is just dead wood. My grandfather had told me these things in bits and pieces over the years. But I was young then, and I dismissed them as an old man's ramblings. Now, seeing these words, each one struck me like a nail hammered deep into my heart. This thin notebook was my grandfather's life's work, the culmination of generations of my family's wisdom. It was priceless. I stayed up all night, reading the entire notebook 3 times. Many things I hadn't understood before, puzzles I couldn't solve, suddenly became clear. As dawn broke, I stood up and walked to the piece of mahogany. I had a complete plan for the restoration. For the next few days, I locked myself in the workshop. Roth called a few times, but I ignored him. I precisely cut a section from the vintage mahogany, matching the dimensions and grain of the broken chair leg. Then came the most critical step, creating a scarf joint. It was an incredibly complex grafting technique described in my grandfather's notes. It required carving perfectly mirrored and interlocking joints on the 2 broken ends. The process allowed for less than 1,000th of an inch of error. Holding my breath, using a carving knife my grandfather had left me, I worked, shaving off slivers of wood. My world shrank to just the wood, the knife, and the sound of my own breathing. The workshop wasn't completely empty during this time. Julian Croft showed up almost every day, pulling up a stool in the corner to watch me work like a curious child. He brought a blonde woman with him. Her name was Vivian. She wore impeccable makeup and designer clothes, and she looked at me like I was a caveman who had wandered into the city. "See, what's so interesting about this?" she asked, wrinkling her nose. "It's all dust and noise. So primitive. You don't get it," Croft said, completely engrossed. "This is art. Vivian scoffed. Art? This is just manual labor. My digital art pieces sell for millions on the NFT market. That's the future. This kind of craftsmanship is already dead. She held up her phone to show me her work, a chaotic collection of color blocks and lines that I couldn't make sense of. I ignored her. We walked different paths. My eyes were only for the piece of wood in my hands. On the seventh day, the last drop of isinglass glue, brewed from the secret recipe in the notebook, seeped into the joint. Using a special clamp, I slowly brought the two pieces of wood together. They met with a soft click, fitting into place perfectly. The seam was invisible. I let out a long breath, feeling as if I'd just been pulled from the water. I looked at the resurrected chair leg. The graft was gone, as if it had never been broken. The grain, the color, the transition, it was flawless. I reattached it to the chair. The 18th century Chippendale stood before me once again, whole and proud. It was more beautiful than before, because now it carried a story of death and rebirth. And it carried a piece of my soul and my grandfather's. To celebrate the chair's rebirth and the workshop's official opening, Roth hosted a small reception in the gallery space. The guests were all heavy hitters from his circle, true titans of industry, along with a few respected elders from the world of antique collecting. Croft came too, with Vivian, the digital artist, in tow. The restored chair sat in the center of the gallery, draped in a red cloth. When a moment was right, Roth invited me to the front. Ladies and gentlemen, I brought you all here today to witness a miracle. He looked at me, his eyes full of admiration, and to proudly introduce my partner, a true master craftsman, Leo Hayes. I wasn't used to this kind of attention and just gave a small bow. Then I walked to the chair and slowly pulled back the cloth. A collective gasp went through the room. An elderly, white-haired gentleman wearing thick glasses practically ran forward. He was a retired curator from the Met, a leading expert on American furniture, Mr. Lou. He wasn't wearing gloves. He always said you had to feel a masterpiece's warmth with your own skin. He bent down, examining the chair from top to bottom, his hands gliding over every inch. His fingers finally came to rest on the leg I had repaired. He caressed it, studied it, his expression shifting from surprise to shock, and finally to utter disbelief. Seamless. He breathed, looking up at me, his eyes shining with excitement. This isn't a repair. This is a resurrection. Young man, what technique did you use? This is simply divine. The other magnates crowded around, their voices a chorus of praise. Just then, a dissonant voice cut through the air. A masterpiece of what? Copying. It was Vivian. She stood with her arms crossed, a look of disdain on her face. So you made an old thing look new again? Where's the creativity in that? She brandished her tablet, which displayed her flashing digital creations. This is creation. This is the art of the future. You people, clinging to your dusty relics, you should have been left behind by progress long ago. Her words cast a pall over the room. Everyone frowned. Even Croft looked uncomfortable. Mr. Lou adjusted his glasses. He wasn't angry. Instead, he calmly walked over to Vivian. Young lady, this is an NFT, is that right? Yes. It represents unique, verifiable digital ownership, Vivian said, lifting her chin proudly. Mr. Lou nodded. Very impressive. But let me ask you a question. 50 years from now, when the servers are shut down, when the file formats are obsolete, when your string of code becomes an unreadable jumble of data, what will be left of your art? Vivian was stunned into silence. Mr. Lou turned and gently patted the Chippendale chair. But this chair 400 years ago, it was here, and it was beautiful. Today, thanks to Mr. Hayes' skill, it is still here, and it is still beautiful. And 400 years from now, as long as there are craftsmen like him, it will still be here, and it will continue to be beautiful. So, you tell me, young lady, he said, his voice gentle but firm, which one of us is truly in danger of being left behind by time? Vivian's face flushed crimson. She couldn't say a word. A ripple of suppressed laughter and applause went through the room. Croft looked at me, and for the first time, I saw genuine respect in his eyes. Just then, my phone vibrated. It was a text from an unknown number. It contained only one sentence. We know what you did to Marcus Thorne. The antique world in this city is small. Watch your step. There was no signature, but the chilling malice came through the screen, cold and sharp. I gripped my phone, looking out at the glittering city skyline. I knew then that this was far from over. I had cost someone money, and in doing so, I had disturbed a dirty, hidden ecosystem. They weren't going to let it go. 11. That text message was a cold needle, piercing the bubble of my recent success. I looked out the window at the gleaming towers, a city that seemed so serene from a distance. But I knew that beneath that polished surface, dangerous currents were moving. Roth and Croft had the power and influence to deal with petty thugs like Marcus Thorne. But the text mentioned the antique world. That hinted at a much larger network, one I knew nothing about. I was a newcomer, a carpenter who had just stumbled into their territory and disrupted their business. They wouldn't take that lying down. In the following days, the workshop was flooded with business. Friends of Roth and Croft, along with collectors who had heard the story, brought in all sorts of treasures. From Art Nouveau lacquered screens to Art Deco furniture, and even fragments of colonial-era wood carvings. I was swamped with work, but a knot of tension remained in my gut. I knew the peace was temporary. A storm was coming. One day, a middle-aged man in a severe, old-fashioned suit, flanked by 2 bodyguards, arrived at the workshop. He introduced himself as Mr. Alastair Finch, the vice president of the New York Collectors Guild. His demeanor was pleasant, his tone polite, but his eyes held a sharp, calculating glint. Mr. Hayes, you truly are a prodigy. Your work on Mr. Roth's chair and Mr. Croft's screen has become the talk of the town, he said. Our guild is dedicated to preserving traditional crafts, and we are so heartened to see a young man like yourself carrying the torch. He paused, then took a scroll from his briefcase. I've come today to ask for your help in restoring a piece from our collection. It's a rather special item. The restoration is extremely challenging. We've consulted several senior experts, and they were all at a loss. We were hoping you might lend us your expertise. I took the scroll and slowly unrolled it. It was a painting, an unremarkable-looking antique painting of a dead, withered tree. But the medium wasn't paper or silk. It was an extremely thin, translucent sheet of wood, almost like the wing of a cicada. A wood veneer painting. My heart jumped. This art form, which had peaked in the 18th and 19th centuries, was incredibly rare. The technique was long lost. You didn't paint on a board. You sliced the wood into paper-thin veneers and then painted on them. The process demanded incredible precision and a wood with unique flexibility. These pieces were also notoriously difficult to preserve, prone to cracking and decay. The painting before me was a wreck. Improper storage had led to widespread cracking and flaking. The withered tree in the painting looked even more broken, as if it might crumble to dust at any moment. Mr. Finch, this is... I frowned. Restoring this would be 100 times more difficult than the chair and the screen combined. It was so fragile that one wrong move could destroy it completely. And there was something else. The painting itself emanated a strange, unsettling aura. The gnarled branches of the dead tree looked like writhing arms. Beneath the tree, a blurry human figure was faintly visible, its face indistinct, but it gave off a palpable sense of dread. Mr. Hayes, do you have any reservations? Mr. Finch asked with a smile. As for the fee, rest assured the guild will be more than generous. Furthermore, if you succeed, this piece will be featured in our guild's annual exhibition. Your name, Mr. Hayes, would be known across the country. Fame and fortune. The temptation was immense, but the feeling of unease in my gut grew stronger. This painting felt like a bad omen, and Mr. Finch's seemingly friendly gaze held something else, a hint of scrutiny, of expectation. It felt like he was expecting me to fail. This had to be it, the trap they had set for me, a trap to ruin my reputation. If I failed, not only would I lose the commission, but the name I had just begun to build would be shattered. I could even be accused of destroying a valuable cultural artifact. I looked at the ruined painting, then at Mr. Finch's smiling face. Should I refuse? That would be an admission that my reputation was overblown, or that I was afraid. No, I couldn't back down. I lifted my head and met his gaze directly. Fine, I'll do it. Mr. Finch's smile deepened. Excellent. Mr. Hayes, your courage is as impressive as your skill. No wonder Mr. Roth and Mr. Croft hold you in such high regard. However, there is something you should know about this painting's history. His smile vanished, and his tone became serious. This piece was donated to the guild by an old collector. It was supposedly passed down through his family. The painting has a name. It's called the Withered Tree, but it has another, less fortunate, nickname, the Sorrowful Tree. Legend has it that anyone who owns it meets with misfortune. That's why it was donated to the guild. The hope was that by restoring it, we could cleanse it of its bad luck. My blood ran cold. This painting was more than it seemed. It wasn't just a restoration project. It was a cursed object, a lure. I looked at the strange, dead tree in the painting and could almost hear a mournful wind howling in my ears. Could my craft really stand against the so-called curse? I didn't know, but I knew I had no way out. 12 after Mr. Finch left, I carefully placed the withered tree on the central workbench. His two bodyguards stood by the door like statues and only left after I had secured the painting in a special climate-controlled case. I stood before the case, staring at the shattered artwork, my mind a turbulent sea. The sorrowful tree. I'd only ever heard of things like that in the folktales my grandfather told. But now one was sitting right in front of me. I pulled out my grandfather's notebook and searched through its pages. There were only a few lines about wood veneer paintings. The art of wood painting is one of utmost subtlety, but it should not be undertaken by any but the most virtuous of heart. Wood has a spirit and is subject to the painter's intent. If the intent is impure, the subject of the painting may become a vessel for malevolence. Malevolence? My grandfather's notes actually mentioned such a thing. A chill went down my spine. Could this painting really be haunted by something evil? I forced myself to be rational. I was a woodworker, not an exorcist. I believe in my hands and my tools, not in ghosts and curses. But my grandfather's words stuck in my mind like a splinter. If the intent is impure, the subject may become a vessel for malevolence. Could the artist have created this piece with malicious intent? I examined the painting again. The gnarled branches of the dead tree looked like grasping claws. The figure beneath it was becoming clearer, and the more I looked, the more my anxiety grew. I took a flashlight and carefully inspected the back of the veneer. The artist's signature and seal were usually placed there. Sure enough, in a dim corner, I found a small line of text. Year of the Rat, Summer, and below it a seal. It wasn't a typical artist's seal. It was a bloody, misshapen image. It looked like a severed hand. I shuddered. The seal was grotesque. It wasn't something an artist would use. It was more like the totem of a curse. I suddenly remembered another passage from my grandfather's notebook about restoring wood veneer paintings. To restore wood painting, one must first read the painting and understand its meaning before ever touching a tool. To attempt a repair without understanding its intent is to risk backlash. Backlash, I whispered to myself. I didn't just have to fix the physical damage. I had to decipher its hidden meaning and possibly fight back against whatever came with it. This was far beyond the scope of a woodworker. I felt a pressure unlike anything I had ever known. This wasn't just a technical challenge. It was a psychological battle. I decided to start with the basics. The first step was cleaning. Years of neglect had left the surface covered in dust and grime. Using a special soft bristle brush, I began to clean it, millimeter by millimeter. As the dust came away, the details of the painting emerged. The withered tree looked even more menacing. The figure beneath it began to take shape. It was a man in a long coat. His head was bowed, and his hands were tied behind his back. At his feet was a dark stain, like blood, and around his neck there seemed to be a deep, dark line, as if from a rope. I sucked in a breath. This was a painting of a death, a painting of an execution. Why would the artist paint such a scene? And why use such a fragile medium to capture such a heavy subject? My gaze fell again on the bloody handprint seal on the back. A wild idea began to form in my mind. What if this painting wasn't a work of art at all? What if it was evidence, a record of some terrible injustice and hatred? If it was evidence, then its curse wasn't supernatural. It was the work of those who were afraid of the truth getting out. My heart hammered in my chest. I felt I was on the verge of uncovering a massive secret. A secret about this painting and about the dark underbelly of this antique world. I was no longer just a woodworker. I had been drawn into a whirlpool, one far deeper and more dangerous than I had ever imagined. I looked at the painting, my expression hardening. It didn't matter if it was the sorrowful tree or a vessel of malevolence. I would restore it, not just for my reputation or my craft, but to bring the secrets it held into the light. I, Leo Hayes, would use my skill to uncover the truth behind this painting and the truth behind this entire corrupt world.